The alarm on the bridge had not even finished its first cycle when the doors tore open and General Vorak Theshun walked in like he already owned the ship. I felt it before I saw it. The air pressure changed. The alien crew around me went rigid, backs straightening, eyes dropping to the floor in that strange, practiced way they always did when someone of high rank entered a room. I did not drop my eyes. I was standing at my post, monitoring the relay logs on the Joint Command deck, and I had exactly one job that hour: keep the translation buffer stable so the humans and the Kathi delegation could speak to each other without a war starting by accident. I did not expect the war to almost start because of me. My name is Lucy Bennett. I was 22 years old, a cadet on my first real deployment, assigned to the Alliance vessel Meridian's Vow as part of the new Joint Command initiative between Earth and the Kathi Assembly. We were 3 months into an arrangement that nobody, on either side, fully trusted. Humanity had been invited into galactic politics less than 2 years earlier, after our first contact turned out far less catastrophic than anyone predicted. The Kathi were the first species willing to let us sit at their table. General Theshun made it very clear, every single day, that he thought this was a mistake. He was enormous, not just tall. Every Kathi soldier was tall, easily 7 feet, with grey-blue skin and eyes that sat slightly too far apart to look friendly. But he moved with a kind of coiled, deliberate weight that made the whole bridge feel smaller when he crossed it. 300 years of Kathi military tradition were built into the way he held his shoulders. He had fought in 2 border wars. He had a reputation, among his own people, for ending arguments before they became arguments. That morning, he stopped in the middle of the bridge, turned his head slowly, and looked directly at me. "Cadet," he said. His translator device gave his voice a flat, mechanical edge, but the contempt still came through clearly. "You are at the primary relay station." "Yes, sir," I said. You did not rise. I felt every human officer behind me hold their breath. I felt every Kathi officer lean, just slightly, toward the moment they expected to happen. "With respect, General," I said, keeping my voice level, "human protocol does not require cadets to leave their post during an active relay cycle. If I step away, the translation buffer drops for 11 seconds. That's a risk I'm not authorized to take without an order." It was true. It was also, I would learn later, exactly the wrong thing to say to a man like Theshun, in front of his own officers, on a day when he was already looking for a reason to remind everyone on that ship who was really in charge. He did not answer right away. He looked at me the way you might look at an insect that had wandered somewhere it did not belong. Then he turned to Captain Daniel Hargrove, who commanded the human contingent aboard the Meridian's Vow, and said something in rapid Kathi that the translator rendered a half-second later. "Your cadet does not understand the meaning of respect." Captain Hargrove was a calm man. I had served under him for 4 months and never once seen him raise his voice. He stepped forward now, hands loose at his sides, the posture of someone trying to lower the temperature in a room without anyone noticing he was doing it. "General," Cadet Bennett followed her operational protocol correctly. "I can walk you through the relay procedure if that would help clarify." "I did not ask for clarification," Theshun said. "I asked why a child in a uniform believes she may remain seated while a general of the assembly stands before her." The word child landed harder than I expected. I kept my hands on the console. I kept my breathing even. 4 months of training had taught me that the worst thing I could do in a moment like this was react. Ambassador Grace Whitfield, the senior human diplomat aboard, arrived on the bridge maybe 90 seconds later, alerted by whoever had the sense to call her the moment Theshun stormed in. She was small, sharp-eyed, and had spent 15 years doing conflict resolution work before humanity had even known aliens existed. She walked in like she had all the time in the world, which I now understand was itself a kind of weapon. "General Theshun," she said, "what seems to be the trouble?" "Your species sends children to command stations and calls it discipline," Theshun said. "I am beginning to understand why the Assembly Council debated your admission for 6 years before allowing it." "Cadet Bennett is 22, Whitfield said. "That is not a child by our standard, and she is not in command of anything. She is monitoring a relay station, exactly as she was assigned to do. On my ship, Theshun said, juniors rise when a superior enters the room. Every time, without exception. It is not a request. It is the foundation on which discipline is built. Without it, an army is a crowd. This isn't your ship, General, Whitfield said, still calm, still perfectly pleasant. It's a joint vessel. Human personnel operate under human protocol during their duty cycles. That was in the treaty your own assembly signed. I watched something shift behind Theshun's eyes. It was small. If I had not been staring directly at him, waiting for any sign of what might happen next, I would have missed it. It was the look of a man recalculating, deciding that logic was not going to get him what he wanted, and choosing a different tool instead. Then perhaps, he said quietly, it is time the treaty was tested. Nobody on that bridge, human or Kathi, understood yet what he meant by that. I certainly did not. I was still standing at my post, still holding the translation buffer steady, still telling myself that this was simply another difficult morning in a difficult assignment, the kind of thing I would laugh about one day, when I was older, and had a dozen deployments behind me instead of one. I had no idea I was about to become the reason an entire galaxy started rewriting everything it thought it knew about my species. The tension on the bridge did not break, it thickened. Other Kathi officers drifted closer, not quite forming a circle, but positioning themselves in a way that made the open floor space around Theshun and me feel smaller, more central, more like a stage. I recognized two of them, Commander Yesiv, who ran tactical operations, and a younger officer named Preth, who I had spoken with exactly twice, both times about scheduling conflicts on the mess deck rotation. Neither of them looked at me with anything close to sympathy. They looked at me the way you look at something that is about to be corrected. Whitfield tried again. General, I understand this is a matter of protocol for you. Let's discuss it properly, through the Joint Command channel, after this shift ends. There's no need to. There is every need, Theshun said. You misunderstand something about my people, Ambassador. We do not delay corrections. A wound left untreated becomes infection. A disrespect left unanswered becomes habit. And habits, once formed among the young, are very difficult to remove. He took a step toward me. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment, because I have told this story many times since, and people always assume I felt fear. I did not exactly. I felt something closer to disbelief. Despite every briefing I had received about Kathi military culture, despite every warning about their obsession with hierarchy and discipline, some part of me had still believed that nothing truly serious could happen here, on a joint command bridge, with an ambassador standing 4 feet away, and a captain watching every move. I was wrong about that. I would be wrong about several things that morning, but some of what I was wrong about would end up changing everything. Captain Hargrove moved to step between us. Theshun did not even look at him. He simply raised one hand, palm out, a gesture so casually commanding that Hargrove actually paused, some old animal instinct in him, recognizing an alpha posture, even from a species he had never had to negotiate power with before that year. Do not intervene, Captain, Theshun said. This is a matter between a superior officer and a junior. It does not concern you. She's my cadet, Hargrove said, and for the first time that morning there was steel in his voice. Everything about her concerns me. Then you should have taught her better. I felt my jaw tighten. I still did not move from my station. I remember thinking, very clearly, that whatever happened next, I was not going to be the one who escalated a diplomatic crisis on my first real deployment. I had trained for 4 years to get this assignment. I was not going to lose it because I flinched, or because I said something I could not take back. I did not realize that the choice was not going to be mine to make. Theshun closed the remaining distance between us in 2 long strides. Up close he was even larger than he looked from across the bridge, his shoulders nearly twice the width of mine, his hands easily large enough to wrap fully around my forearm. His translator device sat just beneath his jaw, a small dark component that pulsed faintly with every word. You will rise, he said, and you will apologize, in front of this crew, for your disrespect, or I will consider this an act of open defiance from your entire species, and I will report it as such to the Assembly Council. Whitfield's voice, behind him, had gone sharp. "General, that is an enormous overreaction to a procedural misunderstanding, and you know it." He ignored her completely. I looked at him. I thought about everything I had been told in the mandatory cross-species briefings before this deployment. Stand your ground without provoking, defer without groveling, protect the treaty above your own pride. I thought about my instructors back on Earth, the ones who had drilled reflex drills into me, until my hands moved faster than my thoughts. I thought, for one strange half-second, about my mother, who had told me the night before I shipped out that the galaxy was going to test us in ways we couldn't predict, and that the only thing she asked was that I come home the same person I left as. "General Thishun," I said, as steadily as I could manage, "I have not disrespected you. I followed the operational protocol I was trained under, on a station I am authorized to operate. I'm happy to discuss this through the proper channel, with the ambassador present, at the end of my shift. But I'm not going to apologize for doing my job correctly." The bridge went completely silent. I saw something pass across Theshun's face that I would only fully understand later, once I had learned far more about Kathi culture than any briefing document had prepared me for. It was not simple anger. It was something closer to genuine confusion, the reaction of a man encountering a kind of resistance his entire framework had not accounted for. Quiet, calm, immovable resistance from someone he had already decided was too small to resist at all. His hand moved. I did not have time to think about what came next. I only had time to react, and in the 4 seconds that followed, everything about how the galaxy understood my species was about to change forever, though none of us standing on that bridge yet knew it. The silence stretched, thin and electric, the kind of silence that exists right before something breaks. Whitfield had stopped talking, Hargrove had stopped moving, even the low hum of the ship's systems seemed to fade into the background, as if the vessel itself understood that something irreversible was about to happen in this small, overlit corner of its bridge. I kept my eyes on Theshun's hand, not out of fear, but out of training. 4 years of hand-to-hand instruction back on Earth had rewired something in me long before I ever left the atmosphere. My instructors used to say that the body remembers what the mind is too slow to decide. I had never fully believed that until this exact moment, standing in front of a 7-foot alien general whose patience had just run out entirely. Nobody on that bridge, watching this unfold, could have predicted what I was about to do, including me. Behind me, I heard Ensign Oliver Kane shift his weight, the small scrape of his boot against the deck plating the only sound in an otherwise frozen room. Oliver had been my bunkmate's brother's friend back at the academy, one of the few familiar faces I had found on this ship full of strangers, human and alien alike. He was not close enough to help me, and both of us knew it. All he could do was watch, the same as everyone else. I thought, in that strange stretched second, about the training facility outside Colorado Springs, where I had spent 4 years, learning to move faster than my own doubts. Our instructors were retired Special Forces operators, veterans of conflicts most cadets had only read about in textbooks, and they had one saying they repeated so often it had become a kind of prayer among us. Speed is not aggression, speed is permission. They meant that hesitation was the real danger, not action. A hand raised against you did not require you to decide whether to respond. It required you to already have decided, long before the moment arrived, exactly what your body would do. I had decided that a long time ago, sitting in a cold gymnasium at 19 years old, sweating through my 3rd defensive drill of the day. I had decided it again during my final evaluation, when my instructor had told me, flatly, that I had good instincts, but needed to trust them faster. I had decided it once more on the shuttle ride up to the Meridian's Vow, staring out at the curve of the Earth, wondering if any of that training would matter once I was standing among people, among species, who had never had to imagine a human being able to defend themselves at all. I remembered, standing on that bridge with Theshun's hand still rising toward me, a single evaluation day from my 3rd year at the academy, one that had never left me in the years since. My instructor that day was a retired Marine named Sergeant Elena Marquez, a woman barely over 5 feet tall, who had once disarmed 3 larger cadets in a training exercise designed specifically to humble overconfident recruits. She had paired me against a cadet named Grant Whitmore, easily 80 pounds heavier than me, a wrestler back in his civilian life before the academy, someone the rest of our class assumed would flatten me within the first 10 seconds of any exercise. Size is information, not destiny, Marquez had told the assembled class before the exercise began, pacing in front of us with the restless energy of someone who had spent decades proving that same point against opponents who never expected her to. Every one of you needs to understand that in your bones before you graduate from this program. A larger opponent has more mass to move and more distance for his strikes to travel. Both of those facts can be turned against him if your reflexes are fast enough and your training is deep enough that you don't have to think about how to use them. I had lost that particular exercise, technically, pinned within 90 seconds by Grant's superior weight once he closed the distance between us. But Marquez had stopped the exercise before declaring a winner, calling the entire class in closer instead. "Watch her hands," she said, replaying a recording of the exchange on the training hall's overhead display, slowed down enough for every cadet to see clearly. She lost the position, yes, but look at how she moved in the first 2 seconds, before he closed the distance. That redirect, right there, that's not something you can think your way through in real time. That has to already live in your hands before the moment arrives. So fast it happens before your conscious mind even finishes registering the threat. She had turned to me directly then, in front of the entire class. "You'll lose fights like this one for another year, Cadet Bennett. Maybe longer. Your build isn't going to change, and neither is the fact that plenty of people you meet out there are going to be bigger than you. But if you keep building what I just showed this class, the moment will come when size stops mattering at all, because your hands will already know what to do before the other person's brain finishes deciding to attack." I had not understood, standing in that cold training hall, 3 years before I ever set foot on the Meridian's vow, exactly how right she would turn out to be. I had not understood that the moment she promised me would arrive not against another cadet in a controlled exercise, but against a 7-foot alien general in front of an entire joint command bridge, with the fate of an alliance's assumptions about my species hanging in the balance of however fast my hands could move. Most of the galaxy still believed humans were soft. It was not an insult, exactly, not to them. It was simply an observation, based on everything they had learned about us in the short time since first contact. We arrived without the biological weapons other species carried naturally. We had no claws, no venom, no armored skin, no enhanced reflexes gifted by evolution on a harsher world. To the Cathy, and to most of the delegations we had met so far, humanity looked like a species that had gotten lucky with tools and machines, but would collapse the moment those tools were taken away. General Thatian believed this more completely than almost anyone I had met. I understood, standing there, that this belief was the real reason for everything happening on that bridge. It was not really about whether I had stood up quickly enough. It was about proving, to his own officers, to the ambassador, to himself, that the treaty allowing humans into command decisions was built on a foundation of sand. If he could make an example of one cadet, quietly, without violence serious enough to trigger a diplomatic incident, he could plant a seed of doubt in every Cathy officer who had ever wondered whether their government had made a terrible mistake. I did not know any of this with certainty in that moment. I only felt it, the way you feel a storm pressure change in your ears before the sky actually breaks open. And some part of me, some part that had been sharpened by 4 years of training and 11 days aboard this ship watching Cathy officers test the edges of the treaty in a dozen small ways, understood exactly what was about to happen a full half-second before it did. Ambassador Whitfield opened her mouth to say something else, some final attempt to pull the moment back from the edge it was teetering on. She never got the words out. Thatian's hand came up, faster than I expected from something his size, aimed not to seriously injure, I would understand later, but to humiliate. An open palm meant to knock me sideways in front of the entire bridge crew, human and Cathy alike. A public correction meant to end the conversation before it could become something larger. My body moved before my mind finished the thought. Everything after that happened in less time than it takes to read this sentence. His palm was already moving through the space between us, when my left hand rose to meet his wrist instead of his hand. I did not block the way I would have blocked a human strike, absorbing the force straight on. I redirected it, the way my instructors had drilled into me 1,000 times, turning his own momentum against the joint, instead of against my body. My right hand came up a half-second later, closing around his forearm, and I stepped into him rather than away, closing the distance so his size stopped being an advantage and started being a liability. The sound his wrist made was small, almost polite, a single sharp click, followed by a low involuntary sound from somewhere deep in his chest that no translator device needed to interpret. I let go and stepped back immediately, hands open, empty, nowhere near a weapon, because some clear, cold part of my mind was already thinking 3 steps ahead, already understanding that whatever had just happened in the last 4 seconds was going to define the rest of my life, and I needed every witness on that bridge to see exactly what I did and did not do. Theshun did not fall. Kathy physiology was built for endurance, and whatever pain receptors fired through that massive frame, he absorbed it the way he had absorbed 30 years of battlefield injuries before this one. But his arm folded inward against his own chest, protective, involuntary, and his eyes, when they found mine again, held something I had never once expected to see directed at me. Not rage, not yet. Something closer to complete and total shock. The bridge stayed silent for exactly as long as it takes a heart to beat twice. Then it broke apart into chaos, all at once, from every direction. Commander Yisiv moved first, closing the gap between himself and me in 3 long strides, his hand already reaching for the restraint baton clipped to his belt. 2 more Kathi officers followed him, spreading out to cut off any path I might have taken toward the exit, though I had not moved an inch since stepping back from Theshun. I stood still, hands still open at my sides, watching 3 armed alien officers converge on me, with the clear intention of taking me into custody on the spot. "Stand down," Captain Hargrove said, and this time his voice was not calm at all. He stepped directly into Yisiv's path, close enough that the Kathi commander had to stop or physically go through him. She did not initiate contact. "Your general struck first. I have a dozen witnesses on this bridge, human and Kathi both, who watched exactly what happened." "She assaulted a general of the assembly," Yisiv said, the translator flattening his fury into something almost mechanical. "There is no version of this where that is acceptable. There is a version where she defended herself against an unprovoked strike from a superior officer," Ambassador Whitfield said, stepping up beside Hargrove, her voice steady despite everything happening around her. "And under the treaty your own government signed 18 months ago, human personnel retain the right of physical self-defense against any act of aggression, regardless of the rank of the aggressor. Article 12. I suggest you read it again before you put a hand on my cadet." The word "my cadet" landed harder than I expected, coming from her rather than from Hargrove. I had spoken to Ambassador Whitfield exactly 4 times since boarding this ship, always briefly, always about logistics. I had no idea, until that exact second, that she had been paying close enough attention to consider me worth defending this fiercely. Theshun straightened slowly, cradling his injured arm against his chest, his breathing controlled but audible, even through the translator's flattening effect. He looked at me for a long moment, and I forced myself to hold his gaze, because looking away now, after everything, would have undone whatever small ground I had just won. "You will pay for this," he said quietly, not to Yisiv, not to Hargrove, but directly to me. "Whatever protection your treaty offers you today, it will not last." "General," Whitfield said, sharp now, cutting between us before I could respond, "I would advise extreme caution with threats made in front of this many witnesses, particularly given that every word on this bridge is currently being recorded by both our systems and yours." That seemed to land. Theshun's jaw tightened, and for the first time since he had walked onto that bridge, I watched him actually calculate, weighing the cost of continuing this in front of an audience against the cost of stopping. He was a soldier who had built his entire career on decisive action, but he was not a fool, and even through the haze of humiliation and pain, Some part of him understood that he had already lost more control of this situation than he could afford to lose further. "This is not finished," he said, and turned, cradling his arm, moving toward the medical bay with 2 of his officers falling in behind him like a small honor guard escorting a wounded king. The moment he was gone, the bridge did not relax. If anything, the tension thickened, because now everyone remaining understood that something had happened which could not simply be walked back. Hargrove turned to me immediately, his eyes scanning me head to foot, checking for injury with the quick efficiency of a man who had commanded soldiers in worse places than this ship. "Are you hurt, Cadet?" "No, sir," I said, and my voice came out steadier than I expected, though my hands, now that the adrenaline was beginning to recede, had started to shake very slightly. "I'm fine." "You're not fine," Whitfield said, not unkindly. "You just broke the wrist of a 3-star general in front of 40 witnesses. Nobody is fine after that." I did not have a response for that. I looked down at my own hands, the same hands that had just moved faster than my conscious thought could follow, and felt a strange, disconnected kind of awe at what they had done without asking my permission first. Oliver Kane appeared at my side, his face pale, his eyes wide with something between fear and disbelief. "Lucy," he said quietly, "what the hell was that?" "I don't know," I said honestly. "It just happened." Around us, the Kathi crew members who remained on the bridge were not looking at me with anger anymore. They were looking at me the way you might look at something you had badly misjudged, a small animal you had assumed was harmless right up until the moment it proved otherwise. Prith, the younger officer I had spoken to twice before about scheduling, stared at me from across the bridge with an expression I could not quite read, somewhere between fear and fascination. Word travels fast on a ship of 600 people, and it travels faster still when the story involves a general losing a physical confrontation with a junior officer from the species everyone had already decided was the weakest one at the table. By the time I reached the human quarters deck 20 minutes later, still trying to process everything that had happened, I could already feel the shift in how people looked at me. Human crew members I had never spoken to nodded at me in the corridor with something like new respect. Kathi personnel I passed went quiet, watching me from the corners of their eyes, recalculating something in real time. Hargrove pulled me aside before I could reach my quarters, guiding me into a small briefing room off the main corridor, empty except for the 2 of us and the low hum of the ship's ventilation system. "I need you to walk me through exactly what happened," he said, "in as much detail as you can remember. Every second of it, because in about 6 hours there is going to be a formal inquiry, and I need your account to be airtight before the Kathi start building theirs." I told him everything, from the moment Teshun walked onto the bridge to the click of his wrist beneath my hands. He listened without interrupting, occasionally jotting something down on the small data pad in front of him, his expression unreadable, but his eyes sharp with the focus of a man who understood that the next few days were going to matter far more than either of us yet realized. "You did everything right," he said finally, when I had finished. "You held your position, you didn't escalate, and when he struck first, you responded with the minimum force necessary to stop him. That's not just self-defense under the treaty. That's textbook, Cadet. I don't know where you learned to move like that, but whoever trained you, they did their job well." "It didn't feel like a decision," I admitted. "It felt like something that happened to me as much as something I did." "That's what good training looks like," Hargrove said. "It stops feeling like a choice and starts feeling like the truth." He was quiet for a moment, studying me with an expression I could not fully place. "You understand this is bigger than you now, don't you? Bigger than one bridge, one general, one bad morning. Every species in this alliance is going to hear about what happened here within a week, and every single one of them is going to start asking the same question." "What question?" I asked. "What else don't they know about us?" he said. "What else has humanity been hiding, without even realizing we were hiding it?" I did not have an answer for that either. I only knew that somewhere in the medical bay of this ship, a general who had built his entire identity around the certainty of his own species' superiority was sitting with a broken wrist, staring at the wreckage of every assumption he had walked onto that bridge believing. And I knew, with a certainty that settled into my chest like something cold and permanent, that whatever came next was not going to be small, and it was not going to be quiet, and it was not going to end with me. 6 hours later, the summons came for the inquiry, and I understood that the real story was only just beginning. The inquiry chamber sat 2 decks below the bridge, a circular room built for exactly this kind of joint proceeding, with a raised platform in the center and tiered seating around the edges for observers from both delegations. I had never been inside it before. Walking through its doors with Hargrove and Whitfield on either side of me, I felt the full weight of what I was walking into for the first time since the moment on the bridge. Not the physical danger, which had already passed, but the political weight of it, the sense that whatever I said in the next hour could shape decisions far larger than my own small career. The panel convened to hear the case included 3 Kathi officials I had never met, all of them older and more decorated than anyone I had yet encountered aboard the Meridian's Vow, along with 2 human representatives from the Joint Command Liaison Office who had shuttled over from a nearby diplomatic vessel the moment word reached them. General Theshun sat across the chamber, his injured wrist wrapped in a dark medical brace, his expression carved from stone. He did not look at me once during the entire proceeding, though I could feel the weight of his attention regardless, the way you feel a fire in a room, even with your back turned to it. The senior Kathi official presiding over the inquiry was an elder named Crescen, whose rank I understood only loosely translated into something like admiral, though her actual authority within the assembly seemed to extend well beyond military matters into something closer to judicial oversight. She had pale silver eyes, unusual even among her own species, and a manner of speaking that was slow and deliberate, each word chosen with obvious care. "We are here," she said, once the chamber had settled, "to determine the facts of an incident that occurred 6 hours ago aboard this vessel, involving General Vorak Theshun and Cadet Lucy Bennett of the human contingent. I want to be clear from the outset that this inquiry is not a trial. It is a fact-finding proceeding intended to establish what occurred so that appropriate action, if any, may follow." She turned to Theshun first, inviting his account. He gave it plainly, without embellishment, describing my failure to rise from my station as a clear breach of protocol, describing his attempt to correct that breach as standard practice within Kathi military discipline, and describing what followed as an unprovoked and disproportionate act of violence from a junior human officer against a superior. I listened to him describe the moment his hand moved toward me, and I noticed, with a small jolt of something close to relief, that he did not lie about it outright. He called it a corrective gesture, a term that made my skin crawl slightly, but he did not deny that his hand had been the first to move. I understood, later, that this was itself a kind of calculation on his part. The ship's internal sensors had almost certainly recorded the entire encounter in perfect detail, and lying about a fact so easily verified would have cost him more credibility than admitting it and reframing its meaning instead. When it was my turn to speak, I gave the same account I had given Hargrove 6 hours earlier, in the same order, with the same details. I did not add anything. I did not soften anything. I described the moment his hand came toward me, and I described what my body did in response, without trying to explain or justify the speed of it, because I genuinely did not have an explanation beyond the truth, which was that years of training had built a reflex faster than my own conscious thought. Crescen listened without interrupting, her silver eyes moving between Theshun and me, as though weighing something invisible between us. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "I would like to review the ship's sensor logs from the bridge," she said finally, "before this panel makes any determination." The logs were displayed on the central projection above the platform, and I watched, along with everyone else in that chamber, the entire encounter play out again, in perfect clarity, slowed to a quarter of its original speed for the panel's review. Watching it from the outside was strange in a way I had not expected. I saw myself standing at my station, calm, steady, refusing to move. I saw Theshun's hand rise, faster than I remembered it feeling in the moment, aimed with clear and deliberate intent, and then I saw my own hands move, and even slowed to a quarter speed, the response still looked impossibly fast, a blur of motion that resolved, in less than the space of a single breath, into his wrist bending at an angle it was never meant to bend. The chamber went very quiet. Crescine had the recording played a second time, and then a third, this time frozen frame by frame at the moment of contact, the exact instant my hand met his wrist and redirected the force of his own strike back into the joint itself. I watched several of the Kathi officials lean forward slightly, studying the frozen image with an intensity that unsettled me, though I could not yet say exactly why. "This is not the reaction time of an untrained junior officer," one of the other panel members said quietly, almost to herself, in a tone that suggested she was speaking a thought aloud rather than addressing the chamber directly. "This is combat conditioning, advanced combat conditioning." "She is 22 years old," Theshun said, his voice sharp for the first time since the proceeding began. "A cadet, barely out of training. This cannot be representative of standard human capability." "And yet here it is," Crescent said, "recorded, verified, and undeniable." "Perhaps, General, the question we should be asking is not whether this cadet is exceptional among her species, but whether we have badly underestimated what her species considers ordinary." The words settled over the chamber like a stone dropped into still water, and I watched the ripples move outward across every face in that room. I saw Theshun's jaw tighten further. I saw two of the other Kathi officials exchange a glance I could not fully interpret. I saw Hargrove, beside me, allow himself the smallest flicker of something that might have been satisfaction, quickly hidden again beneath his professional composure. Crescent turned to address the full chamber. "This panel finds that General Theshun initiated physical contact against Cadet Bennett without provocation sufficient to justify it, under either Kathi military code or the terms of the Joint Alliance Treaty. Cadet Bennett's response, while forceful, falls within the bounds of proportional self-defense as defined under Article 12. No disciplinary action will be taken against her." Theshun did not react outwardly, though I saw something pass behind his eyes that looked almost like the ground shifting beneath him. "However," Crescent continued, and her tone shifted slightly, taking on a weight that felt different from the formal language of the ruling itself, "I would be remiss not to note, for the record, that this incident raises questions extending well beyond this single case. We have operated under the assumption, since the Alliance's inception, that human physical capability was broadly comparable to our own baseline expectations for a species without natural biological advantages. This recording suggests that assumption may require significant revision." She looked directly at me then, for the first time since the proceeding had begun, her silver eyes studying my face with an expression I could not entirely read. Not hostility, not quite curiosity either, but something closer to a kind of careful, dawning reassessment. "Cadet Bennett," she said, "how many years of training preceded your ability to perform the maneuver we have just watched 3 times?" "4 years, ma'am," I said, "at a military academy on Earth." 4 years, she repeated slowly. "And is this level of capability considered exceptional among human cadets, or is it closer to the standard expected of anyone completing that training?" I hesitated, uncertain how to answer in a way that would not sound either falsely modest or dangerously boastful, uncertain, honestly, of the political weight my answer might carry. "It's not exceptional, ma'am," I said finally, choosing honesty over caution. "It's the standard we're trained to reach. There are cadets in my graduating class faster than I am." I watched that answer land across the chamber like a second stone dropped into the same still water, the ripples from it spreading even wider than the first. Crescent sat back slightly in her seat, and for a long moment she said nothing at all, though the silence itself seemed to carry more weight than any further words could have added. The inquiry adjourned soon after, the formal ruling entered into record, my name cleared of any wrongdoing. But I understood, walking out of that chamber with Hargrove and Whitfield on either side of me, that the ruling itself was the smallest part of what had just happened. The real event had been the recording, played 3 times, frozen at the exact moment my hand closed around a general's wrist and broke it in 4 seconds flat. That image was not going to stay contained within one inquiry chamber. It was already moving, through data channels and diplomatic pouches, and whispered conversations in a dozen languages across a ship of 600 people, into a galaxy that had spent 2 years believing it understood exactly what humanity was. It was about to discover how wrong it had been. The days that followed the inquiry moved faster than anything I had experienced since arriving aboard the Meridian's Vow. Within 48 hours, the sensor recording of the encounter had been requested by 3 separate Kathi military research divisions, each citing different justifications, all of them thinly disguised versions of the same underlying question: what exactly had they misjudged about the species they had allowed into their alliance? Ambassador Whitfield explained the situation to me over a quiet meal in the officers' mess, 3 days after the ruling, once the initial storm of attention had begun to settle into something more like a slow, steady undertow. "You need to understand what you actually did up there," she said, stirring a cup of something the ship's replicators produced that vaguely resembled tea. "It wasn't just that you defended yourself, it's that you did it in front of exactly the audience that mattered most. If this had happened in a private room, with no witnesses, Theshun would have quietly buried it, and nothing would have changed. But it happened on an open bridge, in front of 40 officers from both delegations, and it was recorded in perfect detail by systems neither side could dispute or edit." "I didn't plan any of that," I said. "I just reacted." "I know," she said. "That's exactly why it matters so much. If you'd planned it, if it had been some kind of demonstration, they'd have found a way to dismiss it as staged, or exceptional, or irrelevant to the wider species. But you didn't plan it. You just moved, the way you were trained to move, without thinking about the political weight of it at all. And that's precisely what makes it impossible for them to explain away. Over the following week, I began to notice the shift everywhere I went aboard the ship, small at first, then increasingly impossible to ignore. Kathi officers who had previously walked past me without acknowledgement now nodded in my direction, some with what looked almost like wary respect, others with an expression closer to unease, as though recalculating something about me every time our paths crossed. I overheard fragments of conversation in the corridors, in languages I only partially understood through my translator earpiece, references to human reflexes, human training standards, human physiology, that nobody aboard this ship had apparently studied closely enough before now. Oliver Kane found me in the observation deck one evening, staring out at the slow turn of a nearby gas giant through the reinforced viewport, and sat down beside me without saying anything for a long moment. "You know they're running your entire service record through 6 different research departments right now," he said finally. "Kathi Military Intelligence requested access to Human Academy training curricula yesterday. Whitfield's been fielding requests from 3 other delegations since the story got out." "What other delegations?" I asked. "The Varanth Compact submitted a formal inquiry to Command about human physical conditioning standards. The Tayalu Concord asked for a copy of the sensor footage, officially for what they're calling threat assessment purposes, though everyone knows that's not really what it's about." He shook his head slowly. "You broke one general's wrist, Lucy, and somehow that turned into half the Alliance rewriting their assumptions about an entire species." I thought about that for a long moment, watching the gas giant's slow bands of orange and grey drift past the viewport, indifferent to everything happening aboard our small ship in its orbit. "I didn't want any of this," I said quietly. "Just wanted to do my job without getting hit." "I know," Oliver said, "but that's not really up to you anymore, is it? Not after what that recording showed them." He was right, though it would take me longer than I expected to fully understand exactly how right he was. 2 weeks after the inquiry, Captain Hargrove called me into his office, his expression unusually serious even for a man who rarely allowed himself visible emotion. "I need to brief you on something," he said, once the door had sealed behind me. "Command has received a formal request, routed through Ambassador Whitfield's office, from the Kathi Assembly Council itself, not from General Theshun's division, from the Council." "What kind of request?" "General Theshun has asked to meet with you," Hargrove said, "in person. Privately, though a human security officer would be present at your discretion, the request came through proper channels, reviewed and approved by both delegations before it ever reached me." I felt something cold settle in my stomach. Why would he want to meet with me, after everything that happened? "That," Hargrove said, "is exactly what I asked. The answer I got back was vague, something about seeking clarity on matters raised by recent events. But my read on it, for whatever it's worth, is that this isn't about revenge, Cadet. If it were, he wouldn't have gone through official channels this carefully. Whatever he wants from this meeting, I don't think it's the thing you're afraid of. I did not respond right away, turning the offer over in my mind, weighing the memory of his hand rising toward me against the strange, formal politeness of a request routed through an entire diplomatic apparatus. You don't have to accept, Hargrove added. Whitfield made that very clear when the request came through. You can decline, and nobody will hold it against you. I thought about my mother's words again, the ones she had given me the night before I shipped out, about coming home the same person I left as. I thought about the silver-eyed elder in the inquiry chamber, asking whether my speed represented the exception or the standard, and the strange, careful reassessment in her expression when I answered honestly. I thought about General Theshun's face in that moment, right after the click of his wrist, the pure shock of a man encountering something his framework had never accounted for. I'll meet with him, I said finally. I want to understand what this is really about. Hargrove studied me for a long moment, something unreadable behind his eyes. For what it's worth, he said, I think that's the right call. But I'll have a security detail nearby regardless, just in case I'm wrong about him. The meeting was scheduled for the following day, in a small neutral conference room on the diplomatic deck, chosen specifically because it belonged to neither delegation exclusively. In the hours before it, I found myself thinking not about the danger of facing him again, but about something stranger and harder to name, a growing awareness that whatever happened in that room was going to matter far beyond the two of us, that I was somehow standing at the edge of something much larger than one confrontation between one cadet and one general, something that had already begun rippling outward across an entire alliance of species who had built their understanding of humanity on assumptions that no longer held. I did not yet know how right that feeling was going to prove to be. The neutral conference room was smaller than I expected, lit softly, with a single long table running down its center and a wide viewport along one wall, showing the slow drift of stars beyond the ship's hull. As I arrived early, as my instructors had always taught me to do, and found General Theshun already seated at the far end of the table, his injured wrist, still wrapped in its dark brace, resting carefully in his lap. He did not rise when I entered. Neither of us, I think, wanted to test the meaning of that gesture again. A human security officer stood quietly near the door, close enough to intervene if needed, far enough to grant us something resembling privacy. Theshun's own aide waited in the corridor outside, visible through the room's transparent wall panel, but not present within it. This meeting, I understood immediately, had been carefully designed by both sides to feel exactly as controlled and exposed as it needed to. Cadet Bennett, Theshun said, once I had taken the seat across from him, thank you for agreeing to this. I wasn't sure I would, I admitted, after everything. Neither was I sure you would, he said, which is, in part, why I wanted to meet with you directly rather than through a formal channel that would allow either of us to hide behind prepared statements. I said nothing, waiting, uncertain what shape this conversation was going to take. Theshun was quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed not on me, but on the slow drift of stars beyond the viewport, as though gathering something difficult into words he had clearly been rehearsing since the request was first sent. I have served the Assembly for 31 years, he said finally. I fought in the Thren border conflict as a junior officer, and I commanded a full division during the Keswick Uprising 12 years later. I have faced soldiers from 6 different species in direct combat. I tell you this not to impress you, Cadet, but so you understand the weight of what I am about to say. I'm listening, General. In 31 years of military service, he continued, I have never once been caught by surprise in a physical confrontation, not once. Every engagement I have ever fought, I saw coming with enough time to prepare for it, to calculate the threat, to respond according to training built over centuries of Kathi military doctrine. He paused, his good hand tightening slightly against the table's edge. You gave me no such warning. There was no telegraphed movement, no hesitation, no visible calculation before you acted. One moment my hand was moving toward you, and the next, Before I had even registered that you had responded at all, the injury was already done. I wasn't trying to surprise you, I said quietly. I was just reacting to what you were doing. I understand that now, he said. That is precisely what unsettles me. It was not a technique performed deliberately for effect. It was pure reflex, faster than conscious thought, the kind of response that can only exist in a body trained so thoroughly that the training itself has become instinct. I have spent 31 years believing that this level of unconscious combat readiness was something only my own species, and perhaps 2 or 3 others in this alliance, had ever achieved. I did not believe it possible in a species without natural biological advantages. He looked at me then, directly, and for the first time since I had met him, I saw something in his expression that was not contempt, not anger, not even the shock from the moment right after his wrist had broken. It was something closer to genuine, unguarded uncertainty, the look of a man whose entire framework for understanding the galaxy had just been quietly rearranged. I have reviewed the sensor recording 11 times since the inquiry, he said. Each time, I search for some element of it that would explain what I witnessed as an exception, an anomaly, a single gifted individual, rather than a broader truth about your species. I have not found it. Your account to the inquiry panel that this level of capability is considered standard rather than exceptional among your training academies troubles me more than the injury itself ever could. Why does that trouble you more? I asked, genuinely curious now, the fear I had carried into this room slowly giving way to something closer to careful, attentive interest. Because an exceptional individual is a single data point, he said. A standard is a pattern, and patterns, General, tell you something about an entire population, not merely about one person standing in front of you. He paused. If what you told that panel is true, then your species has spent the last 2 years allowing the rest of this alliance to believe it was the weakest member at the table, while quietly maintaining training standards that would place ordinary cadets among the most physically capable individuals in known space. I do not know whether that was deliberate concealment or simple indifference to how you were perceived, but either way, it means every calculation my government has made about humanity's role in this alliance was built on an incomplete picture. I thought carefully before answering, aware that whatever I said in this room was likely to travel far beyond its walls. I don't think it was concealment, General. I think humanity trained the way we trained because our history taught us that we needed to. We spent most of our existence as a species without any guarantee of safety, without natural advantages, surrounded by threats we couldn't outrun or out-armor. So we built training instead, discipline instead of claws, reflexes instead of natural weapons. It wasn't built for you, or for this alliance. It was built a long time before we ever knew you existed. Theshun absorbed that for a long moment, his gaze drifting back toward the viewport and the slow, indifferent turn of stars beyond it. That may be the most unsettling part of all, he said quietly. Not that your species built this capability deliberately to deceive us, but that you built it for entirely different reasons, long before we ever entered your history, and simply carried it with you into this alliance without ever considering how it might be perceived by species who had never needed to build anything like it themselves. He was quiet again, and when he spoke next, his voice had lost some of its earlier formality, settling into something closer to simple, tired honesty. I owe you an apology, Cadet Bennett, not merely for the injury, which was the direct consequence of my own actions, and which I do not dispute, but for the assumption beneath it, the belief that your species could be corrected the way I might correct a junior officer of my own, without consequence, without resistance, without cost. That assumption was wrong, and it was mine alone to carry, regardless of what the inquiry panel ultimately ruled. Thank you, General, I said, and meant it, though I could feel the strangeness of the moment settling over me. An apology I had never expected to receive, delivered with a formality that somehow made it feel more genuine rather than less. I have one further question, he said, if you will permit it. Of course. In the moment before you acted, he said, what did you feel? Not what you did, what you felt. I considered the question carefully, casting my mind back to that stretched electric second on the bridge, his hand rising toward me, the strange calm that had settled over me, even as everything around us seemed to compress into that single instant. "Nothing," I said finally. "That's the honest answer, General. I didn't feel fear, I didn't feel anger, I just felt ready, the way I'd been trained to feel ready, for years, without ever really understanding what that readiness would feel like, until it was actually needed." Something crossed his face then that I would only fully understand much later, once I had learned far more about how this conversation would ripple outward across the Alliance in the weeks and months that followed. It was not fear exactly. It was closer to the particular unease of a soldier who had spent his entire career believing he understood the shape of every threat in the galaxy, encountering for the first time the possibility that an entire species he had dismissed as harmless might, in fact, be something far stranger and far more formidable than anyone in this alliance had yet begun to understand. "No fear," he repeated quietly, almost to himself. "No hesitation, only readiness." He shook his head slowly. "I have fought soldiers from 6 species, Cadet Bennett, and I have never once heard an answer like that." The meeting ended shortly after, without ceremony, without further apology or explanation, simply a quiet acknowledgement between the two of us that something significant had passed between us, that neither of us fully understood yet. I left the conference room and walked back toward the human quarters deck in silence, turning his words over in my mind, unaware that within days, his private assessment of our conversation would find its way into internal Kathi military communications, and from there, into the wider currents of an alliance, already unsettled by what one recording had revealed. 3 weeks later, Ambassador Whitfield brought me a summary of internal assembly communications that had been quietly shared with Human Command through official liaison channels, heavily redacted but unmistakable in their implications. Kathi Military Intelligence had issued an internal advisory to senior officers across every division recommending a full review of assumptions regarding human physical training standards before any future joint operations were planned. 2 other species within the alliance, informed through diplomatic backchannels rather than public disclosure, had requested similar briefings from their own intelligence divisions, a conversation that had begun with one cadet refusing to rise from a relay station was now quietly reshaping how an entire galaxy understood the newest member of its alliance. "You should know," Whitfield told me, over the same quiet meal ritual we had fallen into since the inquiry, "that you didn't just win an argument on that bridge, Lucy. You changed a variable in the way this alliance calculates power. That's not something that gets undone. Species don't forget the moment they realize they've badly misjudged someone." I thought about General Thashun's question in that conference room, about the readiness I had felt in the moment before I moved, a readiness built from years of training, designed for threats none of these alien species had ever needed to imagine facing from us. I thought about the silver-eyed elder's careful reassessment in the inquiry chamber, and the quiet unease spreading through internal Kathi communications, and the strange, slow realization dawning across an alliance that had spent 2 years believing it understood exactly what it had welcomed into its ranks. Humanity had never been the weakest species in this alliance. We had simply never been tested, and somewhere in the quiet corridors of Assembly Command, in briefing rooms across a dozen worlds I had never seen, and species I had never met, that realization was beginning to spread, slow and unstoppable, like the first tremor before a much larger shift. I did not know, standing at the observation deck that evening, watching the same indifferent stars General Thashun had studied during our conversation, that this was only the beginning. I did not know how many other cadets, other soldiers, other quiet moments of unremarkable human readiness were waiting to be discovered by an alliance that had built its entire understanding of us on an incomplete and badly outdated picture. I only knew that something had shifted, permanently, in those 4 seconds on the bridge, and that the galaxy which had once looked at humanity with careless confidence was now looking at us instead with something far more cautious, far more uncertain, and far more afraid. The nightmare, as some of them would later call it, had only just begun. I did not learn how far the story had traveled until a message arrived from my mother, routed through the long delay of interstellar relay, recorded 3 days after she had first seen a heavily edited version of the censor footage circulating on a human news network back on Earth. Her face on the small screen looked exactly as I remembered it, tired around the eyes in the particular way that came from working long shifts at the regional hospital, but there was something else there too, something I had never seen in her expression before. Pride, certainly. But underneath it, a kind of worry I recognized instantly, because I had inherited the same habit of hiding concern behind calm words. "They're playing your face on every channel," she said, in the recording, her voice carrying that particular blend of amazement and unease. "Some professor from the university was on the evening broadcast last night, explaining to 500,000 viewers exactly what a wrist lock is and why it takes years to learn one properly. Your father hasn't stopped showing the neighbors. I told him to stop, that it isn't a parade, but you know how he gets." She paused, and her voice softened. "I just want you to be careful, Lucy. Whatever this turns into, out there, please be careful. You're not just representing yourself anymore. You understand that, don't you?" I understood it more completely than she could have known, sitting 3 months and several hundred light years away from her, watching that recording in the small privacy of my quarters. I had understood it from the moment Crescent's silver eyes had studied me in that inquiry chamber, weighing not just what I had done, but what it might mean about every other human being wearing a uniform across this alliance. The reaction back on Earth, I would learn over the following weeks, through carefully filtered updates from command, had moved in 2 very different directions simultaneously. Among ordinary people, there was a swell of something like relief mixed with pride, a quiet vindication after 2 years of watching human diplomats and scientists treated with careful, condescending patience by species who clearly still viewed us as fortunate children allowed to sit at the adults' table. Among policymakers and military planners, the reaction was far more careful, far more measured, driven by an awareness that the galaxy's perception of humanity had just shifted in ways that could not easily be walked back, for better or for worse. The academy outside Colorado Springs, I would learn months later through a letter from Sergeant Marquez herself, forwarded to me after word of the inquiry finally reached the instructors who had trained me, saw its application numbers triple within a single season after the story broke across Earth's networks. Marquez wrote that she found the surge almost funny, in a tired, knowing sort of way, since the training itself had not changed at all, only the wider recognition of what it had quietly been building in ordinary cadets for decades before anyone outside our own species had reason to notice. "They think you're special," she wrote, "and in a sense you are, because you happened to be the one standing in that moment when it mattered. But you already know, better than any of these new recruits flooding our gates, that what you did on that bridge wasn't a miracle, it was homework. 4 years of it, repeated until it became instinct. I hope you tell them that, whenever this story finally lets you rest long enough to teach instead of simply survive it." I thought about her words often, in the months that followed, watching the wider ripple of that single morning continue to spread across networks and institutions I would likely never see firsthand. Earth's other academies, I learned, had begun quietly revising their own curricula, not to make training harder, but to better communicate, to allied species now paying far closer attention than they ever had before, exactly what our training already produced, and exactly why it existed in the first place. Diplomats back on Earth found themselves fielding a strange, unfamiliar kind of question from Alliance counterparts, questions less about our technology or our resources and more about our history, our psychology, the particular hardships that had shaped a species into something the rest of the galaxy had spent 2 years badly underestimating. Admiral Petra Lindqvist, who oversaw joint command relations from Earth's primary defense coordination office, sent a private communication to Hargrove that he shared with me under strict confidence, 3 weeks after the inquiry concluded. It warned, in careful diplomatic language, that the incident had prompted at least 4 Alliance species to formally request expanded intelligence sharing regarding human military training doctrine, and that Earth's response to those requests would likely shape how the rest of the galaxy positioned itself toward humanity for a generation or more. "We have a choice to make," the message read, according to what Hargrove was permitted to tell me, between reassuring our allies that this was an isolated incident, or allowing them to draw their own conclusions about what an entire species trained the way Cadet Bennett was trained might be capable of, collectively, if the need ever arose. I am inclined toward the second option. I suspect many of you already understand why. I did not fully understand the weight of that choice until I began noticing, in the weeks that followed, how differently the Alliance's other member species began behaving toward the small human contingent aboard the Meridian's Vow. It was not fear exactly, not at first. It was something more like the careful, deliberate courtesy people extend toward something they have recently discovered they underestimated. Officers who had once spoken over me in briefings now waited for my input. Delegations who had treated human representatives as junior partners in every negotiation began, slowly, cautiously, adjusting their language to something closer to equals. A Varanth trade envoy named Ossa Kethril requested a meeting with me directly, 3 weeks after the inquiry, ostensibly to discuss logistics coordination between our two delegations, though it became clear within the first few minutes that logistics were not really the point of the conversation at all. The Varanth were a species I had encountered only rarely aboard the Meridian's Vow, slender and pale, with an unusual habit of speaking in careful, layered sentences that left room for multiple interpretations, a diplomatic style built, I suspected, over centuries of navigating relationships with far more physically dominant species than their own. "We have watched the recording with great interest," Kethril said, once the pleasantries had concluded, her translator rendering her voice in a smooth, measured tone that gave nothing away, not simply for what it revealed about you individually, Cadet Bennett, but for what it revealed about the wisdom of our own assumptions. "My government has spent considerable resources over the past 2 years calculating the strategic value of a closer relationship with your species based entirely on your technological contributions and your usefulness as a diplomatic bridge to other emerging powers. We had not, until recently, given serious consideration to your species' capacity for direct physical conflict because every available signal suggested it was negligible." "And now?" I asked. "And now," she said, "we are recalculating. Quietly and with considerable care, because a species capable of producing ordinary cadets with this level of readiness is a species whose favor becomes considerably more valuable to secure and whose displeasure becomes considerably more costly to risk." I did not know how to respond to that, sitting across from a diplomat whose entire government had apparently begun reassessing humanity's strategic worth because of something that had happened to me on an ordinary duty shift, over a disagreement about whether I should have stood up from my station quickly enough. I thought about Whitfield's words from our meal in the officers' mess, about the variable that had shifted in how this alliance calculated power, and I understood, more fully than I had before, exactly how far that shift had already traveled. "I didn't do anything to earn that kind of reconsideration, Ambassador Kethril," I said carefully. "I just reacted to being struck." "Perhaps," she said, with something that might have been the Varanth equivalent of a small, knowing smile. "But strategic value is rarely built on intention, Cadet. It is built on capability, revealed at the moment it matters most. You revealed something my government did not know existed. What you intended by revealing it matters considerably less than the fact that it is now known." The conversation stayed with me long after Kethril had returned to her own delegation's quarters, a quiet reminder that the ripples from those 4 seconds on the bridge were spreading through channels I would likely never fully see or understand, reshaping calculations in council chambers and intelligence offices across an alliance of species I had barely begun to learn about. General Theshun's own fate within the Assembly's military hierarchy took a strange and unexpected turn over the following month, one that neither Hargrove nor Whitfield had predicted when the inquiry first concluded. I had assumed, given the humiliation of his injury and the very public nature of his defeat, that his career would suffer badly, that he might be quietly reassigned to some distant post, far from any position of real influence. Instead, according to updates Whitfield received through official channels, the Assembly Council had taken the opposite approach entirely. "They've promoted him," she told me, over what had by then become our regular shared meal, her tone carrying a note of genuine surprise, not despite the incident, because of it. Apparently his private report following your meeting with him carried more weight within the council than anyone expected. He didn't try to minimize what happened or protect his own reputation. He told them plainly that he had badly misjudged an entire species, and that every officer under his command needed to understand the implications of that mistake before it was repeated somewhere with far higher stakes than a bridge disagreement. "That doesn't sound like the man who struck me," I said. "People are rarely just one thing, Lucy," Whitfield said. He was a general who genuinely believed, with his entire career as evidence, that hierarchy required physical enforcement to remain meaningful. You didn't just break his wrist, you broke that belief. In front of witnesses he couldn't argue away. Some men would have spent the rest of their career trying to rebuild the illusion. He chose, instead, to rebuild his understanding of the galaxy around the truth you handed him. I thought about that for a long time afterward, turning it over during quiet hours on duty, during the long stretches of relay monitoring that had once felt so ordinary and now felt, somehow, like the calm center of a storm I had accidentally set in motion. I thought about the particular loneliness of being the person other people recalculate around, the strange weight of representing something larger than yourself without ever having chosen that responsibility. 6 weeks after the inquiry, Command reassigned me, at my own request, to a new posting, not away from the Alliance work, which I had come to believe in more deeply than I expected, but toward a newly formed joint training initiative designed to help other species better understand human physical conditioning, its history, its purpose, and its limits. It was Hargrove who suggested it first, over one of our now regular debriefing sessions. "You've become something of a symbol, Cadet, whether you want it to be or not," he said. "I think you have two choices. You can spend the rest of your career trying to avoid that fact, hoping the attention fades, or you can use it, deliberately, to help this alliance understand us more accurately before the next misunderstanding happens somewhere with far worse consequences than a broken wrist." I chose the second option, and in the months that followed, I found myself standing in front of delegations from a dozen different species, walking them through the history and purpose of human physical training, careful each time to explain that our reflexes were not built as a threat to anyone in this alliance, but as an inheritance from a history where we had needed to survive without the natural advantages so many of our new neighbors possessed as a birthright. I watched, each time, the same slow process of recalculation happen in the eyes of whoever I addressed, the same careful shift from assumption to genuine curiosity, sometimes tinged with unease, sometimes with something closer to respect. General Thishun attended one of those sessions, months later, standing quietly near the back of a crowded briefing room aboard a different vessel entirely, his wrist long since healed, though I noticed he still favored it slightly when he moved. He did not approach me afterward. He simply nodded once, from across the room, a small gesture that carried more weight than any formal exchange could have managed, and then he was gone, back to whatever new posting his promotion had carried him toward. Not everyone in the Alliance accepted the new reality quietly, and I learned that lesson in a way far more dangerous than anything the inquiry chamber had prepared me for. 4 months into the training initiative, I was posted temporarily aboard a larger coalition vessel called the Ashen Accord, a ship 3 times the size of the Meridian's Vow, hosting delegations from nearly every species in the Alliance for a rotating series of joint briefings. It was there that I met Sergeant Dral Kesik, a Tyalu soldier assigned to the vessel's internal security division, a man whose reputation among his own people rested on being the fastest close-quarters combatant in his division for 11 consecutive years running. He did not believe a word of what he had seen in the sensor recording. Edited footage, he told me flatly, the first time we spoke, in a training hall set aside for joint physical conditioning exercises between delegations. No untrained cadet moves that fast without assistance. Some kind of neural enhancement, or a rehearsed sequence staged for effect. I do not accuse you of lying, Cadet Bennett. I accuse whoever built the narrative around you of exaggeration. It wasn't staged, I said, and there's no enhancement. I'm happy to demonstrate the maneuver again, slower, if that would help. Slower proves nothing, he said. If you are what they say you are, prove it at full speed, against someone prepared for it this time. Not a general caught by surprise mid-argument. A soldier, ready, expecting exactly what is coming. I should have declined. Hargrove would have told me to decline, had he known about the conversation before it happened rather than after. But something in Keswick's flat, dismissive certainty struck a nerve I did not fully understand until much later, a small ember of the same stubbornness that had kept me at my station on that first bridge, refusing to rise, simply because someone larger than me expected it. "All right," I said. "Show me what you want." We met in the training hall 2 days later, technically an unsanctioned sparring session between two off-duty personnel, though word had clearly spread through both delegations, because by the time I arrived, a small crowd had already gathered along the hall's perimeter, human and alien alike, watching with an intensity that made the air feel thick and charged, before either of us had thrown a single strike. Keswick moved nothing like Theshun had moved. Where the general had struck out of anger, a single overconfident motion born from decades of assuming his authority alone would end any confrontation, Keswick approached with the careful, coiled patience of a soldier who had spent 11 years building a reputation on never being caught unprepared. He circled slowly, testing the distance between us, his hands loose and ready in a stance I recognized from 3 different combat systems at once, an adaptable hybrid, built from years of facing unfamiliar opponents. "Whenever you are ready, Cadet," he said quietly. I did not wait for him to choose the moment this time. I had learned, in the months since the bridge, that reacting was only half the lesson buried in my training. The other half, the half I had never fully needed until now, was understanding when to act first, deliberately, rather than simply responding to someone else's aggression. I moved. The exchange that followed lasted perhaps 11 seconds, an eternity compared to the 4 seconds that had ended things with Theshun, and every one of those 11 seconds tested every reflex I had built over 4 years of training in ways the general's single overconfident strike never had. Keswick was fast, faster than I expected, his hands finding openings I had not anticipated, forcing me to adjust twice mid-exchange, correcting for angles I had not trained against as often as I should have. Twice I felt his hand brush close enough to have connected if I had been a half-second slower. Twice I redirected instead, using his own momentum the way my instructors had drilled into me, turning his speed into a liability rather than an advantage. The exchange ended with Keswick on the ground, one arm pinned behind him at an angle that stopped just short of injury, my knee against his shoulder, both of us breathing hard, the crowd around the hall utterly silent. "Enough," I said quietly. "I'm not trying to hurt you, Sergeant. I'm trying to prove I don't need to." I released him and stepped back, the same way I had stepped back from Theshun months earlier, hands open, giving him room to rise on his own terms. Keswick got to his feet slowly, rolling his shoulder, studying me with an expression that had shifted entirely from the flat dismissal he had carried into the hall 2 days earlier. 11 years, he said quietly, almost to himself. 11 years undefeated in this division, and you did that without a single injury to either of us, holding back the entire time. I wasn't holding back to prove a point, I said. I was holding back because hurting you wasn't the goal. Proving it wasn't staged was. He was quiet for a long moment, and then, to the visible surprise of everyone watching, he extended his uninjured hand toward me, a gesture I recognized from 3 different species cultures as some variation of respect offered between equals. "Then you have proven it," he said, thoroughly. "I owe you an apology for my accusation, Cadet Bennett, and I suspect I owe your entire species a much longer reconsideration than I have been willing to give it until this moment." Word of that sparring match traveled through the Ashen Accord even faster than word of the inquiry had traveled through the Meridian's vow, in part because this time there had been dozens of witnesses from half a dozen species, all watching in real time rather than reviewing a recording after the fact. Hargrove was furious when he learned about it after the fact, precisely as I had expected he would be. "You could have been seriously injured," he said, pacing his office while I stood at something close to attention, absorbing a reprimand I knew I had earned. "Or worse, you could have seriously injured him, in an unsanctioned engagement with no medical team standing by, no diplomatic protection in place if something had gone wrong. Do you understand what a diplomatic disaster that would have been, Cadet, regardless of who came out ahead? I understand, sir, I said. It won't happen again. See that it doesn't, he said, though something in his expression, once the reprimand had run its course, suggested he understood exactly why I had done it, even if he could never officially condone it. For what it's worth, he added, quieter now, Command has already received 3 separate requests from Tayalu Military Intelligence for a formal briefing on human combat training standards, sent within an hour of that sparring match ending. Whatever you proved in that hall today, it's already reshaping conversations happening well above both our pay grades. I thought, standing there in his office, about Keswick's flat, dismissive certainty 2 days earlier, and the quiet, genuine respect in his eyes as he extended his hand toward me on that training hall floor. I thought about how differently that encounter had unfolded from the one with Theshun, not in outcome, but in intention, a general who had struck out of contempt, and a sergeant who had challenged out of honest disbelief, both of them walking away from their encounter with me having learned the same unsettling lesson about what an ordinary human cadet was actually capable of. The pattern, I was beginning to understand, was not going to stop repeating itself. Every species in this alliance was going to need its own version of that lesson, delivered in whatever form finally broke through their particular certainty that humanity remained the safest, softest member of the table. Some would learn it through careful briefings and reviewed sensor footage, the way Crescen's inquiry panel had. Others, like Keswick, would need to test it directly, in person, before they could fully accept it. And I understood, with a growing and uncomfortable clarity, that I was likely to keep finding myself standing at the center of those tests, again and again, for as long as this alliance continued rebuilding its understanding of exactly what my species had been quietly capable of the entire time. Not everyone who watched that shifting balance of power responded with Keswick's honest reconsideration, and the next lesson I learned about the cost of becoming a symbol arrived in a form far more dangerous than a sanctioned sparring match. 6 weeks after the incident aboard the Ashen Accord, Ambassador Whitfield called me into her private office aboard the Meridian's Vow, her expression carrying a weight I had rarely seen from her, even during the darkest hours of the inquiry. I need you to listen carefully, she said, once the door had sealed behind me, and I need you to understand that everything I am about to tell you is classified at a level well above your current clearance. I am briefing you regardless, because it concerns you directly, and because I believe you deserve to know the truth before Command decides how to handle it. What's happened? I asked, feeling something cold settle into my chest even before she answered. Alliance counterintelligence intercepted communications 3 days ago, she said, originating from a faction within the Kathi military we have not previously tracked closely. A splinter group, apparently, operating with some sympathy from senior officers uncomfortable with how quickly the Alliance's power calculations have shifted since your encounter with General Theshun. They call themselves the Preservation Circle. Their stated goal is to slow, or reverse, what they view as an unacceptable elevation of human standing within the Alliance before it becomes irreversible. What does that have to do with me specifically? Whitfield hesitated, and in that hesitation, I understood the answer before she gave it. Your name appeared in 3 separate intercepted communications, Cadet, not as a target for diplomatic pressure, as a target for something considerably more direct. They believe, correctly or not, that removing the symbol undoes the shift the symbol represents. That if the cadet who broke a general's wrist quietly disappears, or suffers a convenient accident, the narrative around human capability loses its most visible face, and species currently reconsidering their assumptions might quietly reconsider their reconsideration instead. The room felt very still. I had faced General Theshun's open hand without hesitation, and Sergeant Keswick's honest challenge without real fear, because both of those encounters, however dangerous, had happened in the open, in front of witnesses, under rules that offered some measure of protection. This was different. This was a threat with no fixed shape, no scheduled confrontation, no honor code governing when or how it might arrive. What is Command doing about it? I asked, forcing my voice to stay level. Increase security around your quarters and duty stations, effective immediately, Whitfield said, A quiet joint task force between human intelligence and the Assembly's own internal security division, since the Council has no more interest in a rogue faction destabilizing the Alliance than we do. And a decision, which I want your input on before it is finalized, about whether to reassign you somewhere less exposed until the threat is contained, or to continue your current posting with expanded protection. I thought about my mother's recorded message, the worry beneath her pride, her plea for me to be careful. I thought about Hargrove's warning, months earlier, that I had become something larger than myself, whether I had chosen it or not. And I thought, finally, about the same stubborn instinct that had kept me at my station on that first ordinary bridge, refusing to let someone else's fear dictate whether I did my job correctly. I want to stay, I said. If I disappear now, quietly, for my own safety, doesn't that hand the preservation circle exactly the outcome they wanted, without them even having to succeed? Whitfield studied me for a long moment, something that looked almost like reluctant pride crossing her features. That's precisely the argument Hargrove made on your behalf, before I even brought this to you, she said. I told him I wanted to hear it from you directly before I agreed. For what it's worth, Cadet, I agree with both of you, but I want you to understand exactly what you're choosing to stay in the middle of. I understood it more fully 3 nights later, when the threat stopped being an abstract briefing and became something immediate and real. I was walking the long corridor between the training hall and the human quarters deck, later than usual after an extended briefing session with a delegation from the Tyalu Concord, the corridor emptier than it should have been at that hour, the overhead lighting dimmed for the ship's night cycle. I noticed the absence of the usual security rotation before I consciously understood why it mattered, a small wrongness that 4 years of training had taught me never to ignore. 2 figures stepped out from a side corridor ahead of me, moving with the deliberate, coordinated positioning of people who had planned exactly where and when to intercept me. Neither wore a uniform I immediately recognized, though something in their bearing, the careful economy of their movement, marked them as trained rather than opportunistic. Cadet Bennett, one of them said, their translator device giving the words a flat, careful neutrality that did nothing to soften the threat beneath them. You will come with us quietly. There is no need for this to become difficult. I did not answer immediately, my mind already running through the corridor's layout, the distance to the nearest security checkpoint, the narrow side passage behind me that offered the only alternative route. Whitfield's briefing had prepared me for the possibility of exactly this moment, though preparation and reality, I was quickly discovering, felt very different once the moment actually arrived. I don't think I will, I said, keeping my voice steady, my weight balanced, my hands loose at my sides, in the same ready stance that had carried me through the bridge, through the inquiry, through the training hall against Keswick. The second figure moved first, faster than the first had spoken, closing the distance between us with the same coordinated precision that had marked their approach. I had exactly as much warning as I had needed on that first bridge months earlier, which was to say almost none at all, and exactly as much training as I needed to make that warning enough. What followed was not the clean, contained exchange I had shared with Keswick in a sanctioned training hall, nor the single decisive strike that had ended things with Theshun in 4 seconds flat. It was messier, faster, more desperate, 2 trained opponents working in coordination against a single target who had no backup, no witnesses, no rules governing what either side was willing to risk. I felt a strike land against my shoulder hard enough to numb the arm briefly, absorbed a second blow across my ribs that stole the breath from my lungs, and understood, in the cold clarity that adrenaline brings, that I was not going to win this through technique alone the way I had against a single overconfident general. I fought the way my instructors had trained me to fight when the clean version of the lesson failed, when numbers or position or surprise stripped away the luxury of a controlled response. I used the narrow corridor itself as a weapon, forcing my 2 attackers into a bottleneck where their numerical advantage meant less than it should have, where only one of them could reach me at a time, regardless of how badly the other wanted to close the distance. I took the second attacker's arm the way I had taken Theshun's wrist months earlier, not gently this time, not calibrated for a public inquiry that would later review the footage frame by frame, but with the full, uncompromising force my training allowed when the goal was simply survival rather than a controlled, forgivable outcome. The corridor's emergency alert triggered somewhere in the chaos, either from my own comm badge or from the security rotation, finally noticing the gap in coverage that had allowed this ambush in the first place, and within 90 seconds, far longer than it had taken to end things with Theshun, but far shorter than it felt living through it, human and Kathi security personnel flooded the corridor from both directions, weapons raised, voices overlapping in the confusion of an incident nobody had fully anticipated arriving this directly, this soon. I was bruised, breathing hard, one arm still numb from the first blow, but standing, and both of my attackers were down, restrained, neither of them seriously injured beyond what the desperate physics of the encounter had required. Whitfield arrived within minutes, her expression somewhere between fury and relief, and behind her, moving faster than I had ever seen him move, Captain Hargrove, his face pale with an emotion I had never once seen him show during any of our previous debriefings. "Are you hurt?" he asked, the same question he had asked on the bridge months earlier, though his voice carried a rawness this time that the earlier question had not. "I'll be fine," I said, and meant it, though the numbness in my arm and the ache in my ribs suggested the medical bay was going to disagree with my assessment for at least the next several hours. The investigation that followed confirmed what Whitfield's earlier briefing had already suggested. Both attackers belonged to the Preservation Circle, low-ranking operatives acting on orders from a mid-level Kathi intelligence officer who had convinced himself, and apparently several others, that removing the Alliance's most visible symbol of humanity's unexpected capability would quietly reverse a shift he viewed as an existential threat to the old order. The operation had been sanctioned by exactly none of the Assembly's legitimate leadership, and when Admiral Crescin learned of it, 3 days later, through channels that moved considerably faster than anyone had expected, her response was swift and, I was told, considerably harsher than even Whitfield had anticipated. "The Preservation Circle has been formally designated an unlawful faction within the Assembly military structure," Whitfield told me, once the dust had settled and I had been cleared by the medical bay to return to light duty. 6 officers have been removed from active command, including the intelligence officer who authorized the operation against you. Admiral Crescin issued a personal statement to the full council condemning the attempt, and I am told, through channels I cannot fully verify, that General Theshun requested to be present for that statement, specifically so he could add his own condemnation afterward. "Why would he do that?" I asked. "After everything between us?" "Because I suspect," Whitfield said, "that whatever this experience taught him about your species, it also taught him something about the difference between a fair test and a cowardly attack. He may have struck you once, out of contempt and misjudgment, but I don't think he has any patience left for people who would rather remove the evidence than accept what it proved." I thought about that distinction often, in the weeks that followed, as my ribs healed and the numbness faded from my arm, and the Alliance's slow, uneven recalculation of humanity's place within it continued to spread, unstoppable now, carried forward by every witness, every recording, every honest and dishonest reaction the shift had provoked. I thought about how differently this final, dangerous encounter had unfolded from the clean, almost contained lessons that had come before it, and understood, with a clarity that felt both frightening and strangely steadying, that this was likely closer to the true shape of what lay ahead. Not every reckoning with what humanity actually was would arrive through inquiry chambers and sanctioned sparring matches. Some of it would arrive exactly like this, in dim corridors, delivered by people frightened enough by the truth to try erasing it rather than accepting it. The nights immediately following the corridor attack were harder than I let on to anyone outside my own quarters, and it was Oliver Kane, of all people, who noticed first. He found me in the observation deck 4 days after the medical bay had cleared me for light duty, sitting in the same spot where I had once watched a gas giant's slow orange bands drift past the viewport, before any of this had grown so large that I no longer recognized the shape of my own life inside it. He did not say anything at first, simply sitting down beside me the way he had months earlier, letting the silence stretch until it felt less like an absence and more like a kind of company. You haven't slept properly since it happened, have you? He said finally. It was not really a question. I keep replaying it, I admitted, surprising myself with how easily the words came, as though I had been waiting for someone to ask, so I would have somewhere to put them. Not the bridge, not the shun. That part I understand completely, even now. It was clean, in its own strange way. Rules, witnesses, a clear beginning and end. This was different. I keep seeing the corridor, how dark it was, how quiet, how close I came to losing, before I even understood I was fighting for something more than an argument. You didn't lose, Oliver said quietly. I know, I said, but I think some part of me keeps replaying it anyway, because winning didn't feel like the bridge did. It didn't feel like proving anything. It just felt like surviving something that was never supposed to happen to an ordinary cadet on an ordinary duty rotation. Oliver was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the same stretch of stars that had witnessed so much of this story unfold since the morning General Theshun first walked onto that bridge. Can I tell you something my sister told me, before I shipped out for this posting? He asked. She's a nurse, back on Earth, works trauma cases in a hospital that sees more of the ugly side of human nature in a single week than most people see in a lifetime. She told me that the people who struggle most afterward aren't the ones who freeze. They're the ones like you, who acted exactly right, exactly fast enough, and still can't quite forgive their own mind for making them relive how close it came to going differently. That sounds about right, I admitted. She also told me, he continued, that the only thing that actually helps is time, and talking about it with someone who isn't going to flinch away from how ugly it actually felt. Everyone out there wants the story where you're fearless, Lucy. The council speech, the sparring match, the wrist you broke in 4 clean seconds. Nobody wants the version where you go quiet at night because a dark corridor still visits you when you close your eyes. But I think that version matters just as much as the other one, maybe more. I thought about that conversation often, in the weeks that followed, turning it over during quiet stretches of duty, understanding slowly that the symbol the Alliance had built out of me was never going to fully capture the person actually living inside that symbol. The one who still, some nights, felt her pulse spike at unexpected sounds in empty corridors, who still had to remind herself, deliberately, that not every shadow ahead concealed another ambush waiting to test whatever the rest of the galaxy had decided humanity actually was. Whitfield arranged for me to speak with the ship's counselor twice a week after that conversation with Oliver. A quiet, unglamorous addition to my schedule that nobody outside a small circle ever learned about, tucked between briefings and training sessions, and the slow, ongoing work of helping other species understand what my species actually was. I did not think of those sessions as weakness, not after Marquez's old lessons about size being information rather than destiny, because I had learned, somewhere in the months since the bridge, that the same principle applied just as easily to fear as it did to physical mismatch. Fear, too, was simply information. It did not have to dictate what came next, as long as I built something strong enough underneath it to keep moving forward regardless. I thought, during one of those sessions, about Preth, the young Kathi officer I had spoken to only twice before the incident with Theshun, always about scheduling conflicts on the mess deck rotation. He found me one afternoon in the ship's small botanical bay, a quiet green space tucked into an unused section of the Meridian's vow that had become, in the months since the bridge, one of the few places I could reliably find silence. "May I sit?" he asked, in the careful, formal way most Kathi officers still addressed me, even now, more than a year after everything had begun. "Of course," I said. He was quiet for a while, studying the small cultivated garden the ship's botanists maintained along one curved wall, rows of earth vegetation grown carefully alongside a few hardy Kathi plant species that had somehow taken root in the shared soil. "I was there," he said finally, "the day it happened. On the bridge, when the general struck you. I did not say anything at the inquiry, because I was not called to testify, but I have thought about that morning many times since." "What do you remember about it?" I asked, curious despite myself. "I remember believing, in the moment before you moved, that the general was correct," Preth said, his voice careful, almost ashamed. "I remember thinking that you had been foolish to refuse him, that your species did not yet understand how our hierarchy worked, and that some correction, however unpleasant, was probably necessary and overdue. I am not proud of having believed that, but I want you to understand that I did, along with a great many officers on that bridge that morning." "What changed?" I asked. "Watching what happened next," he said simply. "Watching a general who had spent 31 years believing size and rank alone commanded respect, discover in 4 seconds that neither of those things meant what he believed they meant. I have spent the year since that morning reconsidering a great many assumptions I never thought to question before, Cadet Bennett, not just about your species, about my own certainty regarding how the universe was supposed to work." I did not have a ready response for that, sitting quietly beside him in the small green quiet of the botanical bay, understanding that this conversation, too, was part of the same slow ripple that had begun on an ordinary bridge and had not yet finished spreading outward through every life it touched. "Thank you for telling me that," I said finally. "I thought you should know," Preth said, "that the shift this alliance is still working through is not only happening in council chambers and diplomatic offices. It is happening quietly, in small conversations like this one, in the minds of officers who watched something happen that they are still trying to fully understand. I suspect that kind of change, slow and private, may matter more in the end than any formal doctrine paper the Council eventually produces." 3 months after the corridor attack, an invitation arrived that neither Whitfield nor Hargrove had anticipated, one that made the earlier meetings with Theshun and Keswick feel small by comparison. The full Assembly Council, the highest governing body of the Kathi civilization, and the closest thing the Alliance had to a central authority, requested my presence at a formal session on their homeworld, to address the Council directly regarding what they were now calling, in official correspondence, the human recalibration. "They don't do this," Whitfield told me, reading through the formal request for the 3rd time as though searching for some hidden complication she might have missed. "The Council almost never invites a foreign national to address them directly, let alone a junior officer barely 2 years into service. This isn't protocol, this is the Council deciding, collectively, that they need to hear from you themselves, rather than through reports and recordings and second-hand briefings." "What do I even say to something like that?" I asked, the weight of it settling over me slowly, the way the weight of the entire situation always seemed to settle, a little more each time, every time I thought I had finally reached the edge of how large this had become. "The truth," Whitfield said simply. "The same thing you told Crescen's inquiry panel, and the same thing you told General Theshun in that conference room. You've never once tried to inflate what happened to you, Lucy, and that honesty is exactly why this has traveled as far as it has. Don't change that now, on the biggest stage you'll ever stand on." The Kathi homeworld, when I finally saw it through the shuttle's viewport 3 weeks later, was nothing like I had imagined during the long months of hearing its name spoken in briefings and reports. Vast grey spires rose from a landscape the color of dark iron, threaded through with rivers that ran a faint luminous blue, I later learned came from mineral deposits unique to their system. The council chamber itself sat at the center of the capital, a massive circular structure that could have swallowed the entire Meridian's vow within its central hall alone, its walls lined with representatives, not just from the Kathi Assembly, but from every species, with formal standing in the Alliance, gathered together in numbers I had never seen assembled in one place before. I stood at the chamber's center, beneath a soft, even light that seemed designed to leave nowhere to hide, facing a gathering of perhaps 200 delegates from a dozen worlds, every one of them watching me with an intensity that made the inquiry chamber months earlier feel, in retrospect, like a quiet rehearsal for this far larger performance. Admiral Crescin presided over the session, her silver eyes finding mine across the vast chamber, with the same careful, assessing patience I remembered from our first meeting. "Cadet Bennett," she said, her voice carrying easily through the chamber's acoustics, "you stand before the assembled representatives of this alliance, not as a defendant, nor as a curiosity, but as a witness to something this body has spent the last year attempting to understand. We ask you to speak plainly, and we thank you for the courage it must take to do so before an audience this large." I thought, standing there, about every version of this story I had told since that first ordinary morning on the bridge, to Hargrove in the small briefing room, to the inquiry panel with its silver-eyed elder, to General Theshan across a quiet conference table, to my own mother through a recorded message crossing hundreds of light years. Each version had been the same underlying truth, told to a smaller and smaller audience each time, and now, standing here, I understood that the audience had finally grown as large as the truth itself deserved. "I didn't come here today to tell you that humanity is dangerous," I began, my voice steadier than I expected, carrying out into that vast, silent chamber. "I came here to tell you the truth about why we are the way we are, because I think somewhere in the last year, in all the recalculating and reassessing, that truth has gotten lost beneath the fear of it." I told them about Earth's long history before any of them had known we existed, a species without claws or venom or armored skin, without any of the natural advantages so many species in that chamber had been given by their own evolution. I told them about the centuries we had spent building discipline and training and reflexes as a substitute for the biological gifts nature had withheld from us, not as a weapon aimed at anyone in this alliance, but as the only inheritance we had ever been able to build for ourselves. I told them about my own 4 years at the academy outside Colorado Springs, about instructors who repeated the same phrase until it became instinct, about the particular ordinary nature of the training that had, without any of us intending it, reshaped how an entire galaxy calculated power. "I didn't break General Theshun's wrist because I wanted to prove something about my species," I said, near the end. "I broke it because my body reacted the way 4 years of training taught it to react, faster than my own thoughts could keep up. That's not a threat. That's just what happens when a species spends its entire history needing to survive without any of the advantages most of you were simply born with. We built readiness instead. And I think the fear spreading through this alliance since that recording surfaced isn't really about what we might do to you. I think it's about realizing you never truly knew what we already were." The chamber was silent for a long moment after I finished, 200 delegates from a dozen worlds absorbing words that I suspected would travel, in one form or another, into every corner of the alliance within days. Crescin studied me for a long moment before speaking again, her silver eyes carrying something that looked, for the first time since I had met her, like genuine and unguarded respect. "Thank you, Cadet Bennett," she said finally. "This council will take your words under careful consideration, alongside the recommendations already prepared by our respective intelligence and diplomatic offices. I suspect it will take this alliance considerably longer to fully absorb what you have told us today than it took you to speak it. But I believe, for whatever my assessment is worth, that this alliance is safer for having heard it plainly, from the person who lived it, rather than through a dozen layers of second-hand analysis." I left that chamber with a strange, settled feeling I had not expected, a sense that whatever came next, whatever fear or respect or careful recalculation continued rippling outward across the alliance, I had at least told the truth as clearly and honestly as I knew how, on the largest stage that truth would likely ever require. I think about that nod often, even now. I think about the strange, accidental way that 4 seconds of pure reflex on an ordinary duty shift reshaped an entire alliance's understanding of what my species was capable of, not through any grand strategy or deliberate demonstration, but simply because I refused to apologize for doing my job correctly, and because years of training I had never expected to need responded faster than my own conscious mind could follow. The galaxy had spent 2 years believing humanity was the newest, softest member of its alliance, a species that had gotten lucky with machines, but would collapse without them. It took 4 seconds, on one ordinary bridge, for that belief to begin quietly, permanently unraveling. Somewhere across a dozen worlds I had never visited, intelligence officers and military planners were still recalculating what else they might have gotten wrong about us, still wondering how many other quiet, unremarkable cadets like me were standing at ordinary posts across 100 human vessels, carrying reflexes built from a history none of them had ever needed to imagine. They were right to wonder, and somewhere deep in that wondering, in that slow, spreading unease among species who had never before had reason to fear the newest member of their alliance, the true beginning of the galaxy's nightmare had already quietly taken root. Command granted me a 2-week leave shortly after the council address, the first time I had set foot on Earth since shipping out, and I spent most of that leave simply sitting in my mother's kitchen, listening to the ordinary sounds of a planet that had no idea, most days, how completely its newest generation of cadets was reshaping the way an entire alliance understood us. My mother hugged me longer than usual at the door, and when she finally stepped back, she studied my face carefully, the way she always had, searching for whatever changes 2 years away might have left behind. "You look tired," she said, underneath everything else. "I am," I admitted, "but I'm still me. I promised you that, before I left, and I meant it." "I know," she said. "I watched the recording of your speech to that council, you know, all of it, twice. I didn't understand half the political context, but I understood you, up there, telling the truth as plainly as you always have, even when it would have been easier not to." She reached out and touched my arm, gently, careful of the shoulder that had still not fully forgotten the corridor attack, though I had told her only the barest outline of what had happened there. "I'm proud of you, Lucy. I just wish the price of that pride hadn't been quite so steep." We spent an afternoon in the backyard, where I had practiced my earliest, clumsiest drills as a teenager, long before any academy instructor had refined them into something sharp enough to matter on a bridge full of strangers from another world. My father grilled dinner the way he always had, and for a few hours, sitting in the ordinary evening light of a planet that had built me long before it ever occurred to anyone that I would need to represent it before an alliance of alien worlds, none of it felt as large or as heavy as it had aboard the Meridian's Vow. It simply felt like coming home, the way my mother had asked me to, still the same person who had left, even if the galaxy around that person had changed almost beyond recognition. I returned to my posting 2 weeks later, steadier than I had been in months, carrying with me the particular kind of calm that only comes from remembering, clearly, exactly what you are fighting to protect, every time the weight of representing something larger than yourself threatens to become too heavy to carry alone. A year after the council address, I received a final piece of correspondence that told me, more clearly than any inquiry ruling or diplomatic briefing ever could, exactly how far that nightmare had already spread. It came from Admiral Lindquist's office back on Earth, forwarded through Whitfield with a note attached that simply read, "Thought you should see this before it becomes public knowledge." The document itself was a summary, compiled from open alliance sources and quiet diplomatic backchannels, of policy shifts across nearly every species, with formal standing in the alliance over the 18 months since that ordinary morning on the bridge of the Meridian's Vow. The Tayalu Concord had quietly doubled the training requirements for their own internal security divisions, citing, in language carefully stripped of any direct reference to humanity, a need to modernize physical readiness standards across all ranks. The Varanth Compact had established an entirely new diplomatic office dedicated solely to human relations, staffed by their most senior negotiators, a level of institutional attention they had previously reserved only for species whose fleets rivaled the Assembly's own. 3 smaller species within the Alliance had submitted formal requests for expanded trade agreements with Earth, requests that Whitfield noted, dryly, had gone unanswered for over a year before the bridge incident, and had suddenly found their way to the top of every relevant queue within weeks of it. And within the Assembly itself, the shift had gone further than perhaps any other single institution in the Alliance. General Thishun, now serving in an expanded advisory role reporting directly to the Council, had authored an internal doctrine paper, portions of which Whitfield was permitted to share with me, arguing that Kathi military planning needed a fundamental revision of how it calculated the relative strength of allied and potential rival species. Physical presence alone, he wrote, was no longer a reliable measure of threat. Training, discipline, and the particular unpredictability of a species that had built its entire capability around necessity rather than natural advantage now had to be weighed as heavily as raw size or numbers. He closed the document, according to the fragment Whitfield showed me, with a single line that I read several times before fully absorbing its weight. We spent 2 years believing we understood exactly what we had welcomed into this alliance. We were wrong, and every calculation built upon that error now requires correction, before some rival power reaches the same conclusion we did, and reaches it with less patience than we were fortunate enough to be shown. I thought about that line for a long time after Whitfield shared it with me, sitting alone in my quarters aboard a ship that had, by then, become something closer to a permanent home than any posting I had held before it. I thought about how strange it was that a single ordinary morning, a single reflex I had never consciously chosen to build, had rippled outward into doctrine papers and diplomatic offices and quiet reforms across an entire alliance of species who had spent 2 years believing they understood exactly what kind of neighbor they had welcomed to their table. Humanity had never set out to become anyone's nightmare. We had built our training the way we built everything else across our long, difficult history, out of necessity rather than ambition, out of the simple, unglamorous need to survive a universe that had given us none of the natural advantages so many of our new neighbors had been gifted at birth. We had carried that training with us into the Alliance without ever fully understanding how it would look to species who had never needed to build anything like it themselves, and it had taken exactly one ordinary duty shift, one moment of quiet stubbornness at a relay station, and 4 seconds of reflex faster than conscious thought, to reveal exactly how much the rest of the galaxy had misjudged us. I do not know, even now, how the story of that single sparring match on the Ashen Accord, that single ambush in a dim corridor, that single address before 200 delegates in a chamber built for a species I had never expected to stand before, will eventually settle into the Alliance's long memory. I know only that the shift it set in motion has not slowed, has not reversed, has continued rippling outward through every channel a galaxy has ever devised for passing fear and respect, and careful recalculation from one power to the next. Somewhere across a dozen worlds, military planners are still rewriting doctrine. Somewhere, intelligence officers are still requesting briefings on human training standards. Somewhere, a preservation circle or something like it is still quietly plotting how to slow a shift that has already, in truth, become impossible to reverse. And somewhere aboard an ordinary human vessel, another cadet is standing at another ordinary post, carrying reflexes she has never yet had reason to test, unaware that the same quiet readiness lives in her hands that once lived in mine, waiting for the moment it will be needed, waiting to teach some other alien officer, on some other bridge, the same lesson General Theshun learned from me in 4 unforgettable seconds. The galaxy had spent 2 years believing humanity was its softest, safest member. It has spent every day since learning exactly how wrong that belief was, one quiet, ordinary encounter at a time, and I suspect, though I cannot know for certain, that the lesson is far from finished teaching itself. Sometimes, late in my duty cycle, I still find myself standing at a relay station, much like the one where all of this began, monitoring the same kind of translation buffer, keeping the same kind of steady watch over conversations between species who are still, slowly, learning how to see each other clearly. I no longer expect anyone to test me the way Theshun once did, though I have long since stopped assuming that certainty is ever permanent in a galaxy this large and this unfamiliar. I simply do my job, the way I was trained to, the way my instructors always insisted I would, without needing to think about the readiness living quietly beneath the surface of my hands. I do not know what the next test will look like, or which species will be the one to deliver it, or how many more cadets like me will find themselves standing at the center of some ordinary morning that quietly reshapes an entire alliance's understanding of what we are. I only know that whatever comes next, I will meet it the same way I met that first strike on the bridge of the Meridian's vow, steady, unhurried, and ready long before I ever consciously choose to be. That readiness, I have come to understand, is the truest inheritance my species carries into this alliance, not a threat, not a weapon aimed at anyone sitting across the table from us, simply the quiet, unglamorous result of a history that demanded we build strength, where nature had given us none, and the galaxy is only now beginning to understand exactly what that inheritance means, for everyone who once assumed we were the softest species in the room.